Good evening to everybody, and welcome to the Lewis Masterclass Intersection. Apologies for the short delay, but we had connecting problem with our two distinguished speakers. Today we're going to be discussing and talking about a very interesting type of intersection. We're going to be focusing on intercultural intersection, and specifically we're going to be focusing on third culture kids. Now, third culture is a term, is a concept which was coined about 50 years ago by an American sociologist called Ruth Hussein in order to illustrate, to indicate kids who are sons or and daughters of military or diplomats or people working for the foreign service who are across different cultures, in fact, in different multicultural environments, to the extent that they would actually somehow bringing with them a different kind of culture, a kind of hybrid culture. I like very much the concept, and actually I was attracted by this concept by a review published on the New York Times by Noor Brara, who was reviewing a recent TV series directed by Luca Guadagnino. The title of the series is Who Are Who We Are, who's actually focused on third culture kids. So to discuss about this topic, this interesting phenomenon, we do have two distinguished speakers today. As I mentioned, we have Luca Guadagnino. He's an award-winning movie director. Each of us will remember surely Calling by My Name. Is a very interesting movie which was broadcasted a few years ago, and there was also directed this very interesting TV series Who Are Who We Are on third culture kids. So welcome, Luca, and good evening. Luca will share the stage with Professor Doris Sommer from Harvard University. Doris is the director of the Cultural Agents Initiative at Harvard University, but she's also the Ira and Jewel Williams Professor of Roman Languages and Literature and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University. Doris' work has revolved around novels of the 19th century which have consolidated Latin American republics. And a recent work is trying to bring in, as she says, humanities to engage with the world. So we also would like to hear from her about this interesting new spin that she has given to her research. So let me start with Luca, who apparently is a third culture kid, or used to be a third culture kid. So he's been moving around different culture, different world. And just to use the words of Noor Brara, apparently third culture experience is clouded by the fog of liminality. So apparently third culture kid belongs to everywhere, but also to nowhere. I'd like to ask Luca about his experience as third culture kid and his perspective on the extent to which we can learn from third culture kid experience. Luca, the floor is yours.
Hello, good evening, everybody. Good evening, Doris. Good evening, Andrea. Yes, it's true that I am a third culture kid because my mom is Algerian and my father was Italian, but they raised my first very formative 6 years of life in Ethiopia, where my father had agreed to teach. He was a professor, and I guess my space has always been such, of someone who has a very strong identity correlated to my Italianness, but at the same time, and as another kind of strong identity that is linked to misplacement or being not in the place in which my fellow Italian friends eventually that I met afterwards were linked to. We Are Who We Are, my TV show, deliberately approaches the topic because in the first place, when I was asked to think about a story about contemporary youth and their dealing with the concept of gender, let's say very fashionable topics. I immediately felt the urgency to escape from the trappings of a fashionable topic, and in particularly to the genericity of a setting such as American suburbia. And I came with the idea of setting the place for these kids to be an abroad other place, a military American base in Italy. This because I feel like their experience, the experience of these kids within the boundaries of this military base, in what could be described as a limen, as a sort of porous, osmotic boundary between the inner Americanness, experimental recreation of a portion of America within the world of the military as well, was in a way interacting with the outer space, the alien space, which was Italy, which is Italy, but it's also mutual. It's like, can be mirrored the other way. Like Italy sees this base as a place, an alien place within its own soil, and the characters, the protagonists of the show, they fully and totally embrace the idea of being lost in a place and time that is going to be for themselves unique and really, how can I say, not unlikely the general sense of belonging to a place and a country, like people brought up and raised in their homelands. I feel like this brings a sense, an experience to these kids that somehow makes them somehow more flexible to the urgency of the present and more capable of managing the hits of the present somehow. It makes them cosmopolitan, but at the same time makes them not cosmopolitan. And this ambiguity, it's what I find interesting in the identity of these characters, which I have to be honest, I found as well in myself.
Thank you very much, Luca. This is a very interesting perspective. I really appreciate it when you mentioned that you feel to have two kinds of identities, an Italian identity and at the same time a misplaced identity, so that somehow leads you to belong to a kind of, you said, an alien place, which is probably is the defining issue about third culture kid. I'd like then to go back to your point about these kids being more flexible to manage the hit of the present, and also to remind that there's your idea of managing multiple identities reminded me about the work of Kwame Anthony Appiah, who's a political philosopher at NYU University, at New York University, who talks about cosmopolitans, and those cosmopolitans are those who actually can juggle with different identities. So let me now turn to Doris. So Doris, which is your perspective on third culture kids? Do you think we can learn from their experience? And as Luca was saying.
Absolutely.
Very well indeed.
Can you hear me clearly? Okay. First, I would like to thank you so much for this invitation and the opportunity to speak on the same screen with yourself and with Luca. I also want to say proudly that Anthony Appiah was my colleague for many years when he was at Harvard. So I know and admire his work very well. Third culture is something that I was happy to learn as a concept, but I grew up with it. Not because I was, an army kid or a diplomatic kid. We used to call them army brats, people who had to negotiate different cultures, but because I'm a product of New York City. And I think I mentioned to you that in New York City, growing up, we used to say that the best thing about the city is that it's so close to the United States. It's a small continent, And I think it has represented every culture you can name. There are languages in New York City that survive when they die at home, because, you know, in exile, languages tend to be more conservative. You mentioned one of my books, which is Foundational Fictions, about the 19th century novels in Latin America that helped to create countries. Let me tell you why I wrote that book. It was because I, as an immigrant kid in New York, where we were all pleasantly different and unpredictable to one another, I imagined that I was a citizen of the United States because my parents were very eager to become citizens after we all emigrated. This was 8 years after World War II ended. And they were stuck in a displaced persons camp in Germany for that long. I was born there with my twin sister. And when we were a year and a half old, we came to the United States with my parents. When they became citizens after 5 years, the lawyers explained that their minor children would automatically be citizens. But it turns out, when I applied to college at the age of 17 and a half, that I was not a citizen, not of the United States, certainly not of Germany, where I was on borrowed territory, certainly not of Europe, where basically we had been eliminated, if not exterminated. I had no political identity at all. And I was fascinated by what that means, by what belonging to a political or national culture means. So I wrote a book about the artificial constructions of nationalism. And in the 19th century, the project was to create something that felt like a coherent culture out of borrowed pieces. And that was the construction of 19th century nationalism. After that, I gave in to my penchant for the kind of flexibility, cosmopolitanism that I was coming from, and what made me fascinated by and critical of national cultures. And so I wrote about bilingualism and about the advantages, not only economic and tourist advantages of knowing more than one language, but the intellectual and emotional and political flexibility that speaking and thinking in more than one grammar, in more than one vocabulary, in more than one set of everyday expressions, the flexibility that that gives you. So I wanted to put that in context of Luca's project and say that it's something precious, this flexibility. It's a vanguard to a cosmopolitanism that we all should acquire. I'm concerned now, even though we narrowly missed being the victims of real tyranny in the United States, I'm concerned that the investments in culture, in an area of the humanities and even of the social sciences in the United States and in many other countries, that investments in these fields that are necessary to forming citizens, those investments are disappearing. I can tell you, and I'll end here, that one of the crises that we're facing in the United States is that the number of graduate students being invited to do PhDs in these fields has been literally decimated, turned into 1/10 of what it was just a year or two ago. The money is not there, the commitments are not there, while democracy hangs by a thread. So I say that to friendly interlocutors, to see what we might be doing in the future as a collective to follow the lead that Luca is showing us, to celebrate third culture, cosmopolitanism, the ethics of it, as well as the pleasure of it. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Doris. I think is coming up a very interesting intersections between Doris, say early life and Lucas. There are a lot of points of contact between your life paths. I loved your expression when you said we came to the United States, and I felt pleasantly different, which is a very interesting way of depicting your approach to diversity. And also, I appreciated when you mentioned the fact that you got interested in the creation of national identities or political identities, and you used the qualifier "they've been artificially created." So this reminded me of another interesting piece of work by Pico Heiler, who is a guy who comes from India but was raised between England and the US, California specifically. And he mentions that, I'm reading verbatim, he says that belonging has little to do with geography, but rather it is a collection of personal interest, ideas, and relationships accumulated over time. This is, resembles very much what you mentioned, Doris. Let me try to elaborate and ask you questions to the two of you, starting with Luca. Luca, you mentioned this idea of flexibility that third culture kid can bring with them. And in fact, since these kids are somehow forced to relate to other culture, with other cultures, they seem to have an advantage on when it comes to managing discontinuities. The issue is that, and this is really an open question, but I'd like to hear from you, the two of you, is that when you learn to relate to other culture with other culture, you can either span those cultures or you can, fall in between the cultures. And this is, you can become somehow trapped, between the cultures. So you may be somehow unable to relate really. So it becomes a kind of a trap. Isn't that the case? Or you think that third culture kids are really, much more able than others in terms of creating new relationship across culture and therefore spanning cultures?
Oh, that's a fantastic question and very difficult to answer without sounding polemic, to be honest. And why so? Because the truth lies not only in the personality of each individual, but mostly it lies in the space that is being offered to, let's say, a thought or a thread of thought that is not mainstream. I feel like, because I'm not a theoretician, I will talk from my perspective, an individual perspective. I believe that being able to somehow encompass in my sense of self and in my vision of things, the beauty of difference and the beauty of the unexpected meeting with the otherness of the other, and the beauty of the flexibility of identities, not the rigidity of identities. It helped me investigate within myself what I really felt was my gaze interested to be put upon. Instead of being somehow constructed and constricted by a set of rules, mostly rules of belonging to an identity that, as Doris said very precisely, is artificial most of the time. Identities that are related to the oppression of the belonging. I feel I have been able to navigate through waves in a way in which I never fell into the interstitial, but actually I was crossing over. Also, I never had honestly the urge to be included by those who can decide whether you are to be included or excluded. And I think that comes also as a strength from this idea of being raised in a world of third culture. Nationalism is leaving the space to a sort of oppression of the identity politics nowadays, and through We Are Who We Are, which is my tiny contribution to the discourse, we wish to be having illustrated, illuminated, expressed, is the idea that the concept of identity, it is beautiful to be approached if that is a sense, that is in a way an uplifting, becoming political sense of freeing yourself. If it becomes a parochial and obtuse, even so well-meant or well-motivated sense of constriction, then it becomes, it goes toward the sense of failure. And I feel like we are mostly heading toward a failure.
This is a beautiful perspective, Luca. I liked again your expression about cultural crisscrossing that I believe has become for you a kind of survival skill across the different cultures that you had to live through. You also mentioned that you were navigating through waves, I think, of culture and different kind of identities. Let me ask now, Doris. We do have a question coming from Francesco, who is one of the students that is attending this masterclass. And Francesco asks, can the third culture help us build a global identity? This is the question of the question, I would say. And then we'll turn back to Luca. First, Doris, what do you think about Francesco's question?
To consider this question, but in the context of what Luca just said. First of all, in the bilingual project, I played a lot with the word belonging, with a hyphen between be and longing, because the lure of nationalism is to long to be something, one thing. And what we're seeing now is that lure of nationalism again, after what it cost us through World War II, and insidiously, on the other side, that looks left-wing, a claim for authenticity. You know, one needs to argue a political point only in first person singular if one is not authentically a particular position or gender or race. One cannot speak to that issue. And of course, we have to be much more careful than we used to be speaking for other people. But somehow that claim to authenticity can be a trap too, as you said, Andre, that will let us fall between identities. I'm reminded of a poem by Pablo Neruda, which is titled Somos Muchos, we are many. And because he was a communist poet, I thought he would be talking about the masses. And it is not at all about the masses. It's about all his multiple identities. I am this, I am that, I am the other thing too. And guess what? Here's another surprise. And so if that can be a model for identity, then we can free ourselves in that same way that Luca was talking about and what he shows in his films. He also mentioned the importance of the context where we fall. If we don't free adults and nationalists from being proud boys, from America, Make America Great Again, from the nationalism that has taken over Hungary again and Poland again. How are our young people going to belong? So, this is, as I say, third culture should be for us a vanguard for rethinking what culture is. And a last point about culture. I think we mentioned that culture means two opposing things. And when we talk to decision makers, we need to keep this very clear. Culture for social scientists, who generally are the decision makers, means the inherited practices and beliefs that you referenced, Andrea, through the Indian scholar who's in the United States now. That's culture. For an anthropologist, for a sociologist, it's a package. And you either have it or you don't. You belong to it or you don't. But if you're a humanist and an artist, the way Luca is, culture is a field for attacking every paradigm that ever existed. It's freedom. It's irreverence. So if we don't keep that measure of freedom inside the opportunities to identify with one culture or many, then we lose the dynamic of what it is to be human. We need to keep both in that dynamic of attacking a paradigm and seeing how that paradigm shifts. So that's maybe my best response to a global identity. It is not one, it is many, and we need to keep these two different definitions of culture in an intense dynamic always, not to let it rest in anything stable, because then we choke ourselves on something that we thought we solved in anti-fascist campaigns.
Thanks, Dore. This is these are I gathered to amongst many two important messages that I'd like to further underline. The first is your perspective of analyzing the term belonging, be hyphenated. This is fantastic. This is longing to be into something, within something. It's great. And then we can further elaborate on it. And the second is the role of arts, which brings in a totally different paradigm as compared or as opposed, of course, in, say, pleasant terms, the paradigm of social science or social scientists. And this leads me to another question from Francesco that will turn to Luca, because Francesco asks also, how important are literature and cinema to building a global culture, provided that, we do not have a global culture, but probably global cultures? Okay.
Again, exactly. I think if it's about the multiplicity of cultures, the thousands of possibilities, the differences, and all the in a very prismatic realm, then yes, if it's about a global culture, that's unnerving to say the least. I believe deeply in the power of culture and in the power of art. And I'm not saying that in a, let's say, a moderate sense. I'm saying that in a guerrilla sense, in a sort of a really provocatively antagonistic sense. I think that the level of, and the depths through which we have to bath ourselves within culture, inside culture, with culture, are really something that we are reclaimed, and we should reclaim for ourselves. Because if we are thinking of culture as a medium for, let's say, social mannerisms, or even worse, for a way into a form of business or entertainment, then we are failing. And I think that the experiences of the artists that I've been struck by, that I've been following, that I still follow in every ways I can, has always been a subversive way of really throwing bombs through cultures and with culture. And in fact, that is something that I urge our younger listeners, because it's in their hands, the possibility of culture, the beauty of discovery, and the rise and the blossoming of new culture, new cultures, new movies, new everything. But only if we agree and we make a pact that they will have to be revolutionary as much as we love the revolutionaries that were before us. Because if not, they would become corporate people, and we don't like that.
That's interesting. When we were talking, Luca, you mentioned the term multiplicity, and by chance, I'm actually reading again the famous American lectures by Italo Calvino, and one of his lectures was in fact on multiplicity and importance of having different, say, articulation of culture, which is the one you're mentioning, and Doris was also discussing. I'm really thrilled by this discussion, and I really like the fact that both of you are underlying the importance of arts and culture to offer students, say, different intellectual tools, different intellectual approach to address reality, but also to create a new future. When you say that culture is fundamental to use the word to revolutionize, but also I think it's getting a different perspective and reading differently the world that surrounds us, and hopefully and really to create new worlds. And as a matter of fact, just to wind up on this this point, this year at Lewis University we are going to be offering students, and provided we are a social science university, we are offering students classes on Italian literature, on archaeology, on history of music, on philosophy. Because again, we do believe that arts and humanities in particular, can offer students different ways of reading realities. This does not mean that we're going to be abandoning social sciences. We do, as Doris was saying, we do need both perspectives. But I think that the crux of the matter lies in the intersection between the two. It's art and humanities and social science. Let me ask, we have another few minutes to spare together. Let me ask you this other question. I'll ask you actually to comment on this. I was reading a few months ago a very interesting speech by Pope Francis on culture. And he said, basically, and I'm trying to synthesize his thinking, and he said, global culture has failed. We do think that culture is a kind of a sphere, and so that culture is a kind of a smooth, a geometrical element that everybody can touch, and the sphere, by definition, every single piece of the sphere has got the same distance from the center of the sphere. And he said that's a wrong metaphor to understand culture. And he said, I'd like to propose the polyhedron. I think the polyhedron is a much better geometrical metaphor to understand culture. I believe you agree about this point, but I'd like you to comment on this. Doris, what do you think about it?
Well, I'm a great fan of our first Latin American Pope. He is a creative thinker, and of course I agree with him. What I would like to do with, just as a footnote to the agreement, though, is to encourage you, Andrea, to recruit Luis University to participate in a project that we're launching. A colleague of yours, Pierluigi Sacco, economist of culture, who works in Milan. He and I are launching a journal called Cases for Culture. In Spanish and probably in Italian, it's casos de cultura. Why? Because I discovered that in all poor neighborhoods in Latin America, when you can afford something about culture, you have a casa de cultura. You can't afford also a theater and a museum and a library and an orchestra center. You have just one modest Casa de Cultura. What we need, though, I said to my friends in Argentina, are casos de cultura. We need to write business cases, law cases, public health cases, social science cases that show the effects with qualitative and quantitative data of the cultural interventions, of the bombs that we throw. I would like to see a Casa de Cultura about Lucas's series. How do children feel after they see it? How do their parents talk to them? What gets into the school system? How do people vote in that neighborhood? I would like to see, the real effects of serious art recognized by social science, not only parallel to social science. I applaud your university for this opening, and I would like to imagine your university being a center for actually getting a dialogue between these two sides of culture. So thank you for allowing me to pull in that direction.
I'll take on the offer, surely, Doris. It's a great opportunity to work with Pierluigi and you on this very interesting path, which is going to be path breaking from the way you describe it and the way, in fact, it is. We do have a few questions. Let me distill one, which is I think is very interesting to wind up this wonderful discussion. It is from Simone, who says, "Why do you think people need to categorize so much identities and identify others based on labels?" Luca, what do you think? Do we really need labels then, or do we need just to get rid of them? Just to push it to the extreme?
Well, I don't want to be like, I don't want to fall on my feet because I'm saying something generic. It's very Anglo-Saxon though, right? The idea of definition. I can talk about what I deal with in my work. You need to explain yourself if you want to be in the conversation within certain spaces and places where things can happen for you in terms of cost of budgets and stuff. Hollywood, for instance, by systematizing everything in a way that can be brought back to something that has already exists and can be like understood. And personally, I feel like that is a missed opportunity. And labels are interesting graphic designer stuff, but not really very interesting when you deal with the other, or when you deal with the how you can become by or belong by the meeting with the other and the otherness of any kind of cultures. But to Simone, I would say don't care. You shouldn't care about being labeled or label anybody. Just don't. Do not.
Thanks, Luca. Doris, what do you think about this labeling thing?
I think you have to unmute me. Yes.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about this a lot, and there's a kind of academic movement a couple of years ago about disidentification, of removing labels, but it doesn't convince me. And for all of the reasons I would like to be convinced, including agreeing with Luca, it doesn't convince me. What convinces me is the superimposition of labels, the contradictions of being this, that, and the other thing, of somos muchos, right? And I can be a woman and a professor. 50 years ago, that was difficult. I can be a woman and a professor and a mother and, a voting citizen and somebody with more than one passport today. although in the United States it's still illegal. I ask my students in a bilingual class, how many people have more than one passport? And more than half the class raises their hand. Okay, so I think that the way out of the inflexibility is to simply say, I have labels, more than one. I imagine instead of, a designer with one sticker, a jacket with lots of stickers pasted on it. That's the way I think about labels. And the contradictions that will be created with that superimposition are the space of freedom. Contradictions are the space of freedom. I remember when Jürgen Habermas was thinking about the challenges of democracy with immigration, one important issue came up, and it was dealt with more by Muslim feminists than by him, but he gave room for that. And Muslim feminists said, look, we don't want to solve contradictions, because if I stop being Muslim, I fall into a Germanic nationalism. If I stop being Germanic, I fall into a patriarchalism that I wanted to leave when I left home. So contradictions are the space of freedom.
Well, it's interesting. I think Luca was actually nodding at what we were saying. So Luca, please step in.
Well, I completely agree with Doris, of course, 100,000%. I do believe that if in that sense label as a sort of a map of contradictions, it's fantastic and it's beautiful and it's welcomed and it's what it is. I was more referring to the idea of the impossibility of getting away from a role or an identity that for many different reasons you are obliged to follow or you feel the urge to follow. But if we talk about contradictions and multiple selves and the beauty of it and the displacement that comes with it, I think it's just exciting and fantastic. And honestly, is the vocation I live with and for.
Very well. Well, thank you very much to the two fantastic speakers we had today, with the fantastic intersections across cultures and across disciplines, and this idea of superimposing labels with identities and to create contradiction, and let me say virtuous tension is a way to continue our masterclass. I'd like to tell our audience that we're going to be having a masterclass on intersection on art and culture, and specifically on cultural heritage towards the end of January. Let me thank again Doris Sommer from Harvard University and Luca Guadagnino, who has, thanks to his work on Who Are We Are, we've managed to have this interesting conversation on cultural intersections. So thanks a lot. Have a good evening and buona serata a tutti.
Grazie.